What if I told you that humanity's greatest mystery, what happens when we die, was solved over 1,000 years ago? The Tibetan Book of the Dead isn't just ancient wisdom gathering dust in monasteries. It's a precise manual that maps consciousness through death's hidden journey, written by monks who claimed direct experience of these realms. While most of us fear death as the ultimate unknown, this text describes it as a structured passage through 3 distinct phases called bardos, each with specific landmarks, challenges, and opportunities. The detail is staggering. Ancient descriptions of light phenomena, consciousness separation, and spiritual encounters that mirror modern near-death experiences with uncanny accuracy. But here's what makes this truly unsettling. The text warns that missing crucial recognition points during this journey can trap consciousness in cycles of confusion for eons. These aren't metaphors or religious platitudes. The monks wrote this as literal navigation instructions, a GPS for the dying consciousness. What they discovered about the moment you draw your last breath challenges everything Western science believes about consciousness and death itself. Picture this: you're lying in a hospital bed, machines beeping around you, your family gathered close. From the Western medical perspective, death is approaching as your vital signs weaken. Your heart rate drops, breathing becomes shallow, brain activity slows. The doctors see biological systems shutting down, a mechanical failure, if you will. But according to the Tibetan Book of the Dead, something extraordinary is actually beginning. While Western medicine focuses on the body's decline, Tibetan Buddhism describes death as the most profound opportunity for spiritual awakening that any human being can experience. Think about that for a moment, not a tragic ending, but the ultimate doorway to liberation. The ancient texts describe a process that unfolds in stages as consciousness separates from the physical body. First, your earth element dissolves, you lose control over your limbs, feeling heavy and unable to move. Then water dissolves, you lose control of bodily fluids, your mouth becomes dry. Fire dissolves next, your body temperature drops, and your digestive system shuts down. Finally, the wind element dissolves, breathing stops. Now here's where it gets fascinating. Western medicine would declare you dead at this point. But the Tibetan teachings insist that consciousness remains present for what they call the inner dissolution. Your senses withdraw one by one: sight, hearing, smell, taste, touch, until you're experiencing pure awareness without any physical anchor. And then comes the moment that the entire Tibetan Buddhist tradition considers the most important instant in your existence, the dawn of the clear light. Imagine the most brilliant, radiant light you've ever seen now. Multiply that by infinity. Practitioners describe it as a luminosity, so pure and overwhelming that it makes the sun look dim by comparison. But this isn't light in the way we normally understand it. This is consciousness itself, stripped of all concepts, all fear, all limitation. It's your own true essence, finally revealed without the filter of physical existence. The texts are very specific about what happens in this moment. As your final breath slips away and your heartbeat fades into silence, your awareness doesn't diminish, it explodes into clarity. You're more awake, more present, more alive than you've ever been in your entire physical existence. Every boundary that once defined you dissolves, and what remains is pure, unlimited awareness. This is the critical moment. If you can recognize this blazing clear light as your own true nature, not something foreign or terrifying, but the deepest essence of who you really are, you achieve instant liberation. No more cycles of death and rebirth. No more suffering. Complete freedom. But here's the challenge that keeps most people trapped. This recognition window lasts only an instant, maybe seconds. And for the vast majority of people, the experience is so overwhelming, so far beyond anything they've encountered in life, that they recoil in fear. Instead of embracing the light, they retreat from it, seeking something more familiar, more comfortable. This is why advanced Tibetan practitioners spend decades preparing for this single moment. They're not just learning philosophy, they're training their consciousness to recognize and merge with this ultimate reality when it appears. Take the practice called phawa, or consciousness transference. Experienced meditators actually rehearse the dying process while alive, learning to project their awareness out through the crown of their head toward enlightened beings. They practice this thousands of times, so that when death actually arrives, the process becomes automatic. Then there's the daily contemplation of impermanence, not morbid dwelling on death, but a systematic training to release attachment to everything temporary. Practitioners meditate on how everything they see, touch, and experience is constantly changing, preparing their minds to let go completely when the time comes. Some monasteries have meditation practices where practitioners visualize their own death in vivid detail, experiencing the dissolution stages over and over until they become comfortable with the process. They're essentially rehearsing for the most important performance of their existence. What's remarkable is how closely these ancient descriptions align with modern near-death experience research. Thousands of people who've been clinically dead and revived report encountering brilliant, loving light that feels more real than physical reality. They describe a sense of coming home, of recognizing something deeply familiar yet infinitely greater than their ordinary consciousness. Dr. Raymond Moody, who coined the term near-death experience, documented case after case of people encountering what they could only describe as pure light, filled with unconditional love and knowledge. Pim van Lommel's groundbreaking study of cardiac arrest patients found that many experienced expanded consciousness precisely when their brains showed no measurable activity. The deeper layers of this ancient knowledge, including specific preparation techniques that go beyond what I can share in a public video, are explored in detail in our newsletter, where we dive into the practical applications that serious students of consciousness need to understand. Now, skeptics will argue this is simply brain chemistry neurons firing randomly as oxygen depletes, creating hallucinations of light and transcendence. But consider this: if consciousness were merely a product of brain activity, how do we explain cases where people report detailed, accurate observations of their surroundings while clinically dead? How do we account for the profound, lasting transformation that so many near-death experiences describe? The Tibetan perspective offers a different possibility. Maybe consciousness isn't produced by the brain but merely filtered through it. When the brain stops functioning, consciousness doesn't disappear, it's finally free to experience its true nature without physical limitations. But here's what the ancient texts emphasize: preparation is everything. The clear light appears to everyone at the moment of death, but recognizing it requires training. It's like trying to look directly at the sun without proper preparation. The intensity overwhelms you. This is why the Tibetan tradition developed such detailed instructions for navigating death. They understood that most people, caught off guard by the sheer magnitude of this experience, would miss the opportunity for liberation. And for those who do miss this first, crucial moment, the texts describe how consciousness continues its journey deeper into the bardo states, where new opportunities for awakening await, but the path becomes increasingly complex and challenging. The clear light represents the ultimate test of spiritual readiness. It's the moment when all your meditation, all your spiritual practice, all your preparation either pays off in complete liberation or reveals that you need to continue the journey through realms that stretch far beyond anything we consider normal reality. Now here's where the Tibetan Book of the Dead reveals something extraordinary. Death isn't just one event, but three distinct stages of consciousness. And here's what most people don't realize: these same stages happen to you every single day. The Tibetans call these stages bardos, and while that word has become synonymous with death in Western minds, it actually means any transitional state. Think about it. You experience bardos when you're falling asleep, waking up, making major life decisions, even in moments of deep creativity or meditation. The death bardos are simply the most profound version of transitions your consciousness navigates constantly. This understanding transforms everything. Instead of seeing the Tibetan Book of the Dead as some mystical guide to an unknowable afterlife, you start recognizing it as the most sophisticated map of consciousness ever created. It's describing the architecture of how awareness itself moves through change. The first bardo, called Chikai, is that moment we explored earlier, when your heart stops and the clear light appears. But think about your own experience of waking up. There's often a split second where you exist in pure awareness before your personality, your problems, your identity comes flooding back. That's a mini Chikai bardo. The text suggests that at death, this state of pure consciousness lasts much longer, and recognizing it, really recognizing it, can lead to complete liberation. But here's the challenge: most consciousness, whether in life or death, doesn't recognize this clear light. It's too unfamiliar, too vast, too different from our normal experience of being someone with thoughts and feelings and memories. So awareness moves into the second bardo. The Chonyad bardo is where things get fascinating and terrifying. This is the realm of visions, where consciousness encounters what the text describes as peaceful and wrathful deities. Now, before you dismiss this as primitive mythology, consider what's really being described here. These aren't external beings judging your soul. They're projections of your own mind, reflections of your inner psychological states magnified to cosmic proportions. Carl Jung, the pioneering psychologist, was captivated by this section of the text. He recognized these deities as perfect representations of what he called archetypal forces, the fundamental patterns that shape human psychology. The peaceful deities represent our capacity for compassion, wisdom, and integration. The wrathful ones embody our repressed anger, fear, and shadow aspects that we've spent lifetimes avoiding. But here's the crucial insight. In the Chonyid Bardo, you're not being attacked by demons or blessed by angels. You're encountering the full spectrum of your own consciousness without the usual filters. Every emotion you've suppressed, every fear you've buried, every moment of love or rage or terror you've experienced, it all appears as vivid, overwhelming visions. You can taste this in your own life during intense transitions. When you're going through a major breakup, doesn't your mind create elaborate stories and projections? You see betrayal everywhere, or you idealize what you've lost. During career changes, don't you experience both visions of spectacular success and terrifying failure? These are Chonyid experiences, your consciousness projecting its inner content onto external reality. The text provides incredibly detailed instructions for navigating these visions. It essentially says, remember, this is your own mind. Don't be seduced by the beautiful visions or terrified by the wrathful ones. They're both equally projections. If you can maintain this awareness, you can achieve liberation even in this second stage. But most consciousness gets caught up in the drama. The peaceful visions might seem too bright, too overwhelming. The wrathful ones trigger panic and flight. This resistance, this inability to recognize your own mind's projections, pushes awareness into the third bardo. The Sidpa Bardo is the realm of becoming, where consciousness, driven by accumulated karma and unconscious patterns, gets pulled toward its next incarnation. This isn't about punishment or reward in some cosmic court. It's about the magnetic pull of unresolved psychological patterns seeking resolution through experience. Think about how this works in your current life. You keep attracting the same types of relationships, finding yourself in similar conflicts, repeating patterns your parents lived. That's karmic momentum, not some mystical force, but the psychological undertow of unconscious conditioning. In the Sidpa Bardo, consciousness experiences this pull as an irresistible attraction to certain life situations. The text describes seeing couples making love and feeling drawn to join them, but this isn't about voyeurism. It's about consciousness being magnetically attracted to the life circumstances that will allow it to work through its unresolved patterns. What's remarkable is how this maps onto modern psychology. We now understand that people unconsciously recreate familiar dynamics, even painful ones, because the unknown feels more threatening than familiar suffering. The Sidpa Bardo is describing this same principle on a cosmic scale. But even here, the text insists, liberation is possible. If consciousness can recognize what's happening, see through the compelling nature of these karmic attractions, it can choose differently. It can select circumstances consciously, rather than being dragged by unconscious compulsions. The practical implications for your daily life are profound. Every major transition you face, changing jobs, ending relationships, moving to new cities, even smaller shifts like changing habits or perspectives, follows this same three-stage pattern. There's always a moment of dissolution, chikai, a period of chaotic visions and projections, chonyid, and then a crystallization into new patterns, sidpa. Understanding this gives you tremendous power. When you're in the middle of life upheaval, instead of being overwhelmed by the intensity, you can recognize, I'm in a bardo state. This chaos is temporary. These intense emotions and projections are my consciousness processing change. If I can stay aware, I can navigate this transition consciously, rather than being swept along unconsciously. Modern consciousness researchers have found striking parallels between these bardo descriptions and reports from people who've had near-death experiences, taken psychedelics, or practiced intensive meditation. The stages described in this ancient text keep appearing in contemporary accounts of expanded consciousness. This isn't coincidence. The Tibetan Book of the Dead isn't describing some culture-specific afterlife mythology. It's mapping the fundamental structure of how consciousness moves through transformation. And once you understand this map, every transition in your life becomes an opportunity for awakening rather than just something to survive. The next sections will take us deeper into each of these bardos, revealing the specific techniques and insights that can transform not just how you die, but how you live through every moment of change. Picture this moment. Your body lies still. Your final breath has passed, yet something extraordinary is about to unfold. Your consciousness, freed from the anchor of physical sensation, suddenly expands beyond anything you've ever experienced. The Tibetan masters describe what happens next as the most crucial moment in your entire existence, a doorway to ultimate liberation that opens for just an instant. You're standing at the threshold between worlds, and before you blazes a light so brilliant, so pure, that it contains within it the very essence of reality itself. This isn't the warm golden glow that many near-death experiencers describe. This is something far more profound, what the Bardo Thodol calls the clear light of death, and it represents the greatest opportunity your consciousness will ever encounter. Here's what makes this moment so extraordinary. According to Tibetan Buddhism, this light isn't coming from some external divine source. It's the recognition of your own mind's true nature, stripped of all the layers of conditioning, fear, and mental chatter that have obscured it throughout your entire life. Imagine suddenly seeing yourself clearly for the first time, not as the collection of thoughts, memories, and emotions you've identified with, but as pure, limitless awareness itself. The stakes couldn't be higher. If you can recognize this brilliant light as your own consciousness, your own Buddha nature, you achieve what Tibetan practitioners call liberation in the first bardo. This means immediate freedom from the cycle of death and rebirth, instant enlightenment that surpasses decades of meditation or spiritual practice. But here's the challenge. You have only moments to make this recognition before the opportunity passes forever. Think about how difficult it is right now, in your ordinary waking state, to step back from your thoughts and simply observe them without getting caught up in their content. Now imagine trying to do this when you've just died, when everything familiar has dissolved, and you're confronted with a light so intense it's beyond anything in human experience. Most consciousness, the texts tell us, recoils from this brilliance like someone suddenly exposed to blazing sunlight after hours in darkness. This is why Tibetan practitioners spend years preparing for this single moment. They practice what's called clear light meditation, learning to recognize the subtle luminosity that's always present in awareness but usually hidden beneath the noise of daily consciousness. During deep meditation, advanced practitioners can access states that mirror this death experience, familiarizing themselves with the quality of pure awareness so they'll recognize it when it matters most. There's another practice called phawa, or consciousness transference, where meditators learn to deliberately eject their consciousness through the crown of their head, essentially rehearsing the death process while still alive. Masters of this technique can actually create a small opening in their skull from repeated practice, demonstrating their ability to consciously direct awareness during the transition of death. What's fascinating is how closely these ancient descriptions align with modern near-death experience research. Dr. Kamen. Kenneth Ring's studies found that people who've had profound NDEs consistently report encountering an incredibly brilliant light that seems to contain infinite love and knowledge. Many describe this light as somehow being their own true self, not a separate entity. The commonality across cultures and religious backgrounds suggests we're dealing with a fundamental feature of consciousness itself, not just religious belief. Neuroscientist Dr. Eben Alexander, after his own near-death experience, described encountering a light that was indescribably brilliant, yet somehow didn't hurt to look at directly. He emphasized that this wasn't just illumination, it was pure, conscious awareness that felt more real than ordinary reality. This matches precisely what the Bardo Thodol describes as the clear light experience. But here's why most people miss this incredible opportunity. We've spent our entire lives identifying with our thoughts, emotions, and physical sensations. When these familiar anchors suddenly disappear at death, instead of recognizing the pure awareness that remains, most consciousness panics and desperately searches for something familiar to grasp onto. It's like being so accustomed to the noise of a busy city that when you're suddenly placed in perfect silence, you can't appreciate the peace, you just want the familiar chaos back. The text describes exactly what happens when this recognition fails. The brilliant clear light begins to fade, and consciousness starts generating more familiar but less enlightened experiences. It's like having the ultimate spiritual teacher right in front of you, but being so overwhelmed by the encounter that you run away before receiving the teaching. This is where the traditional practice of reading the Bardo Thodol to dying individuals becomes crucial. A skilled practitioner sits with the dying person and guides them through each stage. Remember, the light you're seeing is your own awareness. Don't be afraid of its brilliance. Merge with it completely. This is your Buddha nature revealing itself. These instructions serve as a lifeline for consciousness that might otherwise be swept away by the intensity of the experience. You don't have to wait until death to begin preparing for this moment. Every time you practice mindfulness meditation, you're developing the ability to recognize awareness itself rather than just its contents. When you sit quietly and notice thoughts arising and passing away, you're training for the ultimate test, maintaining recognition of the observer, even when everything else dissolves. Contemplating impermanence is another powerful preparation. The more deeply you understand that everything in your experience, your body, thoughts, emotions, even your sense of personal identity is temporary, the less likely you'll be to panic when these familiar landmarks disappear at death. Instead of clinging to what's dissolving, you'll be ready to recognize what remains. Death, from this perspective, isn't the enemy we've been taught to fear. It's the ultimate teacher, offering us the most direct possible encounter with our true nature. Every spiritual tradition has some version of this understanding that what we really are transcends physical death, and that dying can be the doorway to the most profound awakening possible. But what happens when this first, golden opportunity is missed? When consciousness recoils from the clear light and begins seeking familiar ground? That's where the journey becomes more complex. As awareness enters the second bardo, the realm of visions, experiences, and choices that will determine the next phase of existence. The clear light opportunity may be gone, but the adventure of consciousness has only just begun. The question isn't whether you'll face this moment, you will. The question is whether you'll be ready to recognize the light of your own awareness when it blazes before you, offering the ultimate liberation in the space of a single, eternal instant. Picture this: you've just encountered the brilliant, clear light, that moment of pure consciousness, but like most of us, the intensity was too overwhelming. You couldn't maintain that state of perfect awareness. Now, as your consciousness begins to stir again, you find yourself in what can only be described as the most elaborate theater production ever conceived, except you're both the audience and the star, and every character on stage is a reflection of your own psyche. This is the second bardo, the realm of visions, and what happens here will determine whether you achieve liberation or get pulled deeper into the cycle of rebirth. But here's what makes this so fascinating from a psychological perspective. Everything you encounter, every divine being, every terrifying demon, every elaborate scenario, is a projection of your own mind. The Tibetan Book of the Dead isn't describing some external supernatural realm. It's mapping the landscape of human consciousness itself. The experience begins with what the text calls the peaceful deities. Imagine beings of such radiant beauty and compassion that they seem to embody everything noble about existence. You might encounter Buddha figures emanating infinite love, wisdom beings whose very presence feels like coming home, goddesses representing perfect clarity and understanding. These aren't random spiritual entities. They're mirrors reflecting your own highest potential, your capacity for awakening, your innate wisdom that's been there all along. What's remarkable is how this ancient Tibetan understanding aligns perfectly with what Carl Jung discovered about the human psyche centuries later. Jung identified these same archetypal patterns in his work on the collective unconscious, universal symbols and figures that appear across cultures because they represent fundamental aspects of human psychology. The peaceful deities of the Bardo are essentially what Jung would call the self-archetype, representing wholeness and spiritual realization. But here's where it gets intense. If you can't recognize these peaceful visions as projections of your own enlightened nature, if you're still caught up in the illusion that they're separate from you, the experience shifts dramatically. The peaceful deities fade, and you enter the second phase, the wrathful deities. Now the theater of your mind becomes something far more challenging. You encounter beings that seem torn from humanity's deepest nightmares, fierce, powerful entities with faces of fire and fury. The text describes figures like the Supreme Haruka, a multi-armed being with blazing eyes and a presence so intense it seems to shake the very foundations of reality. These aren't punishments or external demons trying to harm you. They're forced confrontations with everything unresolved within your own psyche. Think about what Jung called the shadow, all the aspects of ourselves we've rejected, denied, or pushed into the unconscious. Every moment of unprocessed anger, every fear we've avoided facing, every attachment we haven't released, every jealousy or resentment we've carried, all of this emerges as these wrathful deities. They appear terrifying because we've made them terrifying through our resistance and denial. The test in this bardo is deceptively simple but incredibly difficult. Can you recognize these intense visions as products of your own mind rather than external threats? Can you maintain the awareness that these powerful beings, whether beautiful or terrifying, are all projections of your own consciousness? Success leads to liberation. Failure means getting caught up in the drama, reacting with fear or desire, and getting pulled deeper into karmic entanglement. What makes this so relevant to our daily lives is that we're actually encountering these same forces constantly, just in much subtler forms. Every time someone triggers a strong emotional reaction in you, you're meeting a mini version of these bardic visions. That person who makes you furious, they're showing you your own unprocessed anger. The individual you find irresistibly attractive, they're reflecting your own projections of desire and completion. In relationships, we're constantly encountering these peaceful and wrathful deities in human form. We project our idealized images onto romantic partners, seeing them as perfect, divine, capable of completing us, until reality sets in and the wrathful deities appear. Suddenly, the same person who seemed like salvation becomes the source of our greatest frustration. But both the idealization and the demonization are projections, not reality. The practical application of this ancient wisdom is profound. When you understand that your triggers are teachers, that your emotional reactions are showing you exactly what needs attention within your own psyche, you can start working with these forces instead of being overwhelmed by them. That colleague who constantly irritates you, they're pointing you towards some unintegrated aspect of yourself. The fear that keeps you awake at night, it's a wrathful deity demanding acknowledgement and integration. This is what Jung meant by individuation, the process of integrating all aspects of the psyche, both light and shadow. The Tibetan masters understood this centuries ago. Liberation comes not from avoiding or conquering these inner forces, but from recognizing them as aspects of your own consciousness and learning to work with them skillfully. Here's the revolutionary insight that bridges ancient wisdom and modern psychology. What you'll encounter in the death bardo reflects exactly what you're carrying within you right now. Those unprocessed emotions, those rejected aspects of yourself, those patterns of projection and reaction, they don't disappear when you die. They become the very fabric of your bardic experience. This means your spiritual work isn't separate from your psychological work. Every time you catch yourself projecting onto others, every moment you choose to face a difficult emotion instead of avoiding it, every instance where you recognize your own mind's tendency to create drama, you're preparing for the ultimate test of consciousness that awaits in the bardo. The text emphasizes that recognition is liberation. In that moment when you can see a terrifying, wrathful deity and think, this is my own mind's creation, this is my own unprocessed anger taking form, in that moment of recognition, the deity dissolves and you're free. But if you react with fear, if you try to fight or flee, you're pulled deeper into the illusion. As we prepare to explore the third and final bardo, where consciousness, having missed these opportunities for liberation, begins the process of seeking rebirth, remember that every day offers you practice for this ultimate test of awareness. The question isn't whether you'll face these inner forces, but whether you'll recognize them as reflections of your own mind when the time comes. Picture yourself drifting in an infinite ocean of pure consciousness, where the very fabric of reality responds to your every thought like ripples across water. This is the third bardo, the realm where you become both sculptor and clay, architect and blueprint of your next existence. Unlike the previous bardos we've explored, where you encountered the clear light and faced the projections of your psyche, this space operates by different rules entirely. Here, every unresolved emotion, every karmic imprint you've accumulated across lifetimes, acts like a magnetic force with its own gravitational pull. The Tibetan masters described this process with startling precision. Your consciousness, no longer anchored to a physical body, finds itself in a state of intense creative chaos. Think of it like this. Imagine every decision you've ever made, every moment of kindness or cruelty, every flash of wisdom or ignorance, suddenly becoming visible threads of light extending in all directions. These threads don't just represent your past, they're actively weaving the pattern of what comes next. What makes this bardo particularly fascinating is how it reveals the mechanics of consciousness itself. You're not passively floating towards some predetermined destination. Instead, You're actively creating through the very act of being aware. Every thought generates what the texts call karmic winds, currents of energy that carry you toward experiences that match your internal state. If you've cultivated patience and compassion throughout your life, these qualities create a resonant frequency that draws you toward circumstances where those traits can flourish. Conversely, patterns of anger, attachment, or fear generate their own magnetic pull towards situations that reflect those energies back to you. The visions that appear during this phase aren't random hallucinations or divine interventions, they're precise reflections of your inner landscape. You might see radiant palaces floating in golden light, representing potential rebirths in realms of great beauty and ease. Or you could witness turbulent storms and dark landscapes, reflecting the pull toward more challenging incarnations. Some practitioners report seeing specific families, cultures, even particular moments in time that call to them with inexplicable familiarity. Here's where the process becomes deeply personal. A consciousness steeped in intellectual curiosity might find itself drawn toward visions of libraries, universities, or families where learning is treasured. Someone whose life was marked by service to others could see hospitals, temples, or communities in need. The artist's consciousness gravitates toward creative environments, while the warrior's spirit seeks challenges and conflicts to overcome. But here's the crucial insight the Bardo Thodol emphasizes. You do have influence over this process, though not in the way you might expect. You can't consciously choose your next life like selecting items from a menu. Instead, your level of awareness during this transition determines how much conscious participation you have in the unfolding. Those who maintain clear recognition that all these visions are projections of mind, neither inherently real nor illusory, can navigate with greater wisdom. The text describes specific moments of opportunity within this chaos. Sometimes, you'll encounter what appear to be doorways or passages of light. The tradition teaches that approaching these openings with detachment and compassion, rather than desperate grasping or fearful avoidance, can lead to more favorable circumstances. Some advanced practitioners reportedly maintain such clarity during this process that they can choose rebirth specifically to benefit others, the bodhisattva ideal in action. This understanding transforms how we think about daily life right now. Every interaction you have, every choice you make, every thought you allow to take root in your mind is literally shaping not just your current experience but the trajectory of consciousness itself. When you respond to someone's anger with patience instead of reactivity, you're not just improving that moment, you're strengthening neural pathways and karmic patterns that will influence how consciousness moves through future transitions. The practical implications are profound. Buddhist psychology recognizes that we're constantly creating karma through three channels: body, speech, and mind. Physical actions obviously generate consequences, but the tradition places equal emphasis on the karma created through our words and even our thoughts. That moment when you choose compassion over judgment, when you speak truthfully instead of deceptively, when you cultivate gratitude rather than resentment, these aren't just nice ideas. They're literally programming the operating system of consciousness. Modern neuroscience actually supports aspects of this ancient understanding. We now know that repeated thought patterns create physical changes in brain structure through neuroplasticity. The pathways we strengthen through practice become our default responses. From this perspective, the Bardo teachings are describing what happens when consciousness continues operating according to these established patterns, even after the brain that housed them has died. The Tibetan tradition offers specific practices for transforming karmic patterns while we're still embodied. Mindfulness meditation trains the ability to observe thoughts and emotions without being swept away by them, exactly the skill needed to maintain awareness during Bardo transitions. Tonglen, or compassion breathing practice, involves consciously taking on suffering and sending out relief, literally rewiring our default responses from self-protection to service. Perhaps most importantly, the tradition emphasizes conscious living as the foundation for conscious dying and conscious rebirth. This means paying attention to the quality of your thoughts throughout ordinary days. When you notice yourself falling into habitual patterns of blame, criticism, or fear, you can recognize these as the very forces that will shape future experience. Instead of being a victim of unconscious conditioning, you become an active participant in consciousness evolution. The psychological insight here extends far beyond religious belief. Whether or not you accept literal rebirth, the Bardo teachings reveal how we're constantly creating our reality through unconscious patterns. The person who habitually sees threats everywhere lives in a different world than someone who looks for opportunities to help. These aren't just different perspectives, they're different realities, created moment by moment through the focus and quality of attention. Understanding this process empowers you to make conscious choices about the reality you're creating right now. Instead of reacting automatically from old conditioning, you can pause, recognize the creative power of this moment, and choose responses that align with who you want to become. This is the practical magic the Bardo Thodol offers. Not escape from the human condition, but conscious participation in its ongoing creation. Here's something that completely revolutionized my understanding of death, and more importantly, how to live. While Western culture treats death as the ultimate taboo, something to avoid thinking about at all costs, Tibetan Buddhists approach it as the most important subject you could possibly study. They don't see death preparation as morbid or depressing. Instead, they view it as training for your soul's greatest adventure. Think about it this way: if you knew you were going on the most challenging expedition of your life, one that would determine your future for potentially thousands of years, wouldn't you want to prepare? That's exactly how Tibetan practitioners view death. It's not an ending to fear, but a transition to train for with the same dedication an Olympic athlete brings to their sport. The cornerstone of this training is called phawa, consciousness transference. Imagine learning to aim an arrow with perfect precision, except instead of hitting a target, you're directing your awareness toward enlightenment at the moment of death. Practitioners spend years developing the ability to consciously guide their consciousness out of the dying body and toward liberation, rather than getting swept away by the chaos and confusion that typically accompanies death. But here's what fascinated me most. These death practices don't just prepare you for dying, they completely transform how you live right now. Let me share the daily practice that changed everything for me: impermanence meditation. Each morning, before getting caught up in emails or rushing to work, you pause and genuinely contemplate that this day might be your last. Not in a frightening way, but with deep appreciation. You remember that everyone you'll encounter today is also temporary, that every conversation could be your final one with that person, that every sunset is unrepeatable. When you truly absorb this reality, not just intellectually but in your bones, something remarkable happens. Petty annoyances evaporate. That argument with your spouse about dishes becomes absurd when you remember you have limited time together. The stress about your presentation at work shrinks when you consider what really matters in the grand scheme of existence. Colors become more vivid, conversations more meaningful, moments more precious. One practitioner I met in Dharamshala told me that after years of impermanence meditation, she stopped getting angry in traffic jams. "How can I waste my precious remaining moments being furious at strangers?" she asked. "Every minute spent in anger is a minute I'll never get back." Another transformative practice is Tonglen, literally meaning taking and giving. You breathe in the suffering of others and breathe out love and healing. This sounds counterintuitive at first. Why would you deliberately absorb pain? But Tonglen systematically dissolves the self-centeredness that keeps us trapped in fear. Here's how it works practically. When you see someone struggling, maybe a homeless person, an angry co-worker, or even someone who's hurt you, you breathe in their pain with genuine compassion. Then you breathe out whatever they need: peace, healing, love, understanding. You're training your heart to expand beyond its usual narrow concerns. This practice becomes crucial for navigating the bardos we discussed earlier. Remember those wrathful deities and terrifying visions? A heart that's been trained in compassion doesn't react with terror when faced with these manifestations. Instead, it recognizes them as projections of consciousness and responds with love rather than fear. Compassion literally transforms your afterlife experience. The sound practices are equally profound. Tibetan mantras aren't just religious recitations, they're precise technologies for consciousness. When you repeat Om Mani Padme Hum thousands of times, you're not just saying words. You're using specific sound vibrations to tune your mind like a divine instrument, aligning your consciousness with higher awareness states. I've watched practitioners whose minds have become incredibly stable through decades of mantra repetition. They face life's challenges with an unshakable calm because they've trained their consciousness to remain centered, regardless of external circumstances. When death arrives, they're not thrown into panic. Their minds are already accustomed to maintaining awareness through any experience. But let's get practical about how this applies to your daily life right now. You don't need to become a monk or spend years in retreat to benefit from these insights. Start each morning by setting an intention based on impermanence. Before checking your phone, spend 2 minutes remembering that this day is unrepeatable. Ask yourself, If this were my last day, how would I treat the people I encounter? What would actually matter? Throughout the day, practice mini Tonglen sessions. 9T. When you encounter someone who's suffering, even if it's just someone looking stressed on the subway, breathe in their difficulty and breathe out whatever healing you can offer. You'll be amazed how this shifts your entire relationship with other people's pain from avoidance to compassion. Choose a simple mantra and repeat it during routine activities. While washing dishes, walking, or waiting in line, silently repeat Om Mani Padme Hum, or even just peace or love. You're training your mind to rest in positive states, rather than getting caught in worry or mental chatter. The psychological benefits are immediate and measurable. Anxiety decreases when you stop trying to control an inherently uncertain future. Presence increases when you remember each moment's preciousness. Relationships deepen when you interact with others knowing your time together is limited. Priorities clarify when you regularly contemplate what actually matters. This is the revolutionary insight. Preparing for death doesn't make you morbid or depressed. It makes you more alive. When you stop running from mortality and start embracing it as your greatest teacher, every day becomes more vivid, every relationship more meaningful, every choice more intentional. If you're ready to begin this transformation, start tomorrow morning with just 5 minutes of impermanence reflection. Ask yourself, what would I do differently today if I truly understood that my time here is limited? This simple practice can begin shifting your entire life perspective immediately. The Tibetan approach reveals something our death-phobic culture misses entirely. The people who are most prepared for death are often the most fearless and joyful in life. They've made friends with uncertainty, developed unshakable compassion, and trained their consciousness for the ultimate adventure. But even with all this preparation, the Tibetan tradition recognizes that navigating death and the bardos requires more than individual practice. It requires guidance from those who've walked this path before. Picture this. You're lying in your final moments, but instead of sterile medical equipment and hushed, worried voices, there's a calm presence beside you. A trained lama sits near your bed, holding an ancient text, speaking in measured tones about the journey your consciousness is about to undertake. This isn't fantasy, this is how Tibetan Buddhists have approached death for over 1,000 years, transforming what we consider life's greatest terror into a guided spiritual expedition. The person reading to you isn't offering empty platitudes about going to a better place. They're providing you with a detailed roadmap of the territories your awareness will traverse, complete with landmarks, potential detours, and navigation instructions. The Bardo Thodol becomes your GPS through realms most people can't even imagine, and your guide becomes the most important companion you'll ever have. Western medicine treats death as a biological failure to be postponed at all costs. We pump bodies full of medications, attach them to machines, and measure success by how long we can delay the inevitable. But what happens to the person's consciousness during this process? In most cases, absolutely nothing. No preparation, no guidance, no understanding of what they're about to experience. It's like sending someone on the most important journey of their existence without a map, compass, or traveling companion. Tibetan Buddhist death practice flips this entire approach. Death isn't a medical emergency, it's a spiritual opportunity that requires just as much skill and preparation as any other significant life transition. The guide sitting with you has spent years studying the bardos, understanding the psychological and spiritual terrain your consciousness will navigate. They know that in the first moments after death, you'll encounter what the text calls the clear light of reality, a brilliant, overwhelming radiance that represents your own essential nature. Here's where the guidance becomes crucial. Most people, unprepared for this intensity, recoil from the light. It's too bright, too vast, too different from anything they've experienced. But your guide knows this moment is coming and has been preparing you. Don't fear this radiance, they tell you. This isn't something foreign or threatening. This is your own awareness recognizing itself without the filters of physical existence. Merge with it. Rest in it. If you miss that first opportunity, and most people do, the guide continues reading as your consciousness moves into the next phase. Now you'll encounter what appear to be divine beings, some peaceful and serene, others fierce and terrifying. Without guidance, these visions seem completely external, like encountering gods and demons from some cosmic realm. But your guide keeps reminding you of the fundamental truth. These aren't separate entities. They're projections of your own mind, aspects of your consciousness appearing in symbolic form. When peaceful deities appear radiant, Buddhas surrounded by pure light, your guide encourages recognition. These represent your own compassionate nature. Don't worship them as external saviors. Recognize them as reflections of your own awakened potential. When wrathful figures emerge, terrifying beings with multiple heads and arms, surrounded by flames, the guidance shifts. Don't run from these appearances. They're not punishing you. They represent the fierce wisdom that cuts through illusion. They're showing you aspects of your own mind that you've never fully acknowledged. This is where the Bardo Thodol reveals its genius. It's not just describing some objective afterlife landscape that everyone experiences the same way. It's providing a framework for understanding how consciousness creates its own reality during the death process. Your guide helps you recognize that every overwhelming vision, every terrifying or beautiful appearance, emerges from your own mental patterns and conditioning. The most revolutionary aspect of this guidance is its ultimate goal: liberation from the entire cycle of death and rebirth. Most consciousness, according to these teachings, gets swept along by the intensity of Bardo visions, eventually finding itself drawn toward another incarnation. But with proper guidance and recognition, awareness can achieve something much more profound: complete freedom from the cycle altogether. Your guide knows the critical moments when this liberation becomes possible. They're watching for signs of your consciousness, recognizing its own nature in the midst of all these appearances. Remember, they might say, everything you're experiencing right now is empty of inherent existence. These visions have no more reality than dreams. Rest in the awareness that's observing all of this. Modern people often ask how they can access this kind of guidance without being born into Tibetan Buddhist culture. The answer is both encouraging and challenging. The principles can be learned and adapted, but they require serious study and preparation. Some hospices now train staff in conscious dying techniques. Family members can learn basic guidance principles, helping their loved ones approach death with less fear and more understanding. The growing conscious dying movement in the West borrows heavily from these Tibetan practices. Death doulas study Bardo teachings to help people prepare for their final transition. Some medical professionals are beginning to recognize that addressing spiritual needs during dying might be just as important as managing physical symptoms. But here's what really matters about this tradition. It reveals the profound compassion possible in human relationships. Having someone walk beside you through the ultimate unknown, offering direction when you're navigating the most disorienting experience possible, this represents care at the deepest level. Your guide isn't just reading words from a book. They're serving as your anchor to wisdom when everything familiar dissolves. This kind of guidance requires spiritual community throughout life, not just at death's approach. The most effective death guides are people who've spent years contemplating these teachings, practicing meditation, and developing familiarity with the territories of consciousness the dying person will explore. If you're intrigued by these possibilities, start by studying the Bardo teachings themselves and connecting with communities that take conscious dying seriously. Death remains mysterious, but it doesn't have to be a journey you take alone or unprepared. The Tibetans discovered something profound. With the right guidance and preparation, even death can become a doorway to awakening. What if I told you that the Tibetan masters discovered something revolutionary? That by fully embracing your mortality, you don't become morbid or fearful, but instead unlock a level of clarity, purpose, and joy that most people never experience. This isn't about becoming obsessed with death. It's about using the awareness of life's impermanence as the ultimate teacher for how to truly live. Think about how our culture handles mortality. We avoid the topic, medicalize it, hide it away in hospitals and funeral homes. We spend billions on anti-aging products and pretend death happens to other people. But here's what the Tibetan practitioners understood centuries ago. This avoidance isn't protecting us, it's keeping us trapped in a kind of sleepwalking existence where we postpone authentic living until tomorrow, next year, or someday when conditions are perfect. The Bardo Thodol doesn't just prepare you for death, it teaches you to recognize that you're already dying, every single moment, and that this recognition is the key to waking up from the trance of unconscious living. Every breath you take is one breath closer to your last. Every sunset you witness brings you one day nearer to your final evening. Instead of finding this depressing, the Tibetan masters found it liberating. When you truly internalize that this conversation we're having right now might be among the last 1,000 conversations of your life, something shifts. When you realize that you might only have a few hundred more meals with the people you love, you start paying attention differently. When you understand that your remaining sunrises are numbered, whether that number is 50 or 50,000, each one becomes precious in a way that transforms your entire relationship with time. This isn't morbid thinking. This is awakening to reality. And paradoxically, this awareness doesn't make life heavier, it makes it lighter. When you stop carrying the unconscious weight of pretending you're immortal, when you release the exhausting burden of avoiding the inevitable, you free up enormous energy for actually living. The Tibetan tradition teaches something called impermanence meditation, but it's not what you might expect. Instead of sitting in lotus position contemplating skulls, you practice recognizing the bardos, the transition states that are happening constantly in your everyday life. Every relationship that ends is a small death. Every job you leave, every home you move from, every phase of life you outgrow, these are all mini-deaths that offer opportunities to practice conscious navigation of change. That breakup you went through last year? That was bardo training. The anxiety you felt when changing careers, you were already practicing for the ultimate transition. The grief you experienced when your childhood home was sold, your psyche was rehearsing for letting go of everything familiar. The Tibetan masters recognized that life is constantly giving us opportunities to practice dying consciously, but most of us miss these lessons because we're too busy trying to make everything permanent. Here's where this gets practical. Start your morning with what I call impermanence awareness. Not a depressing reminder that you're going to die, but a clarifying recognition that today is finite and precious. Before you check your phone or dive into your routine, take 30 seconds to remember that this day will never come again. This specific configuration of light, weather, people, and possibilities exists only once. How does that change what you choose to focus on? The Tibetans developed a practice called Tonglen, literally giving and receiving, where you breathe in suffering and breathe out relief. This isn't masochism. It's training for the kind of open-hearted living that becomes possible when you're not constantly protecting yourself from life's impermanence. When you stop trying to shield yourself from pain, loss, and change, you also stop shielding yourself from joy, connection, and beauty. Try this. The next time you're with someone you care about, practice what the tradition calls clear light recognition. Look at them and really see them, not just their physical form, but the awareness looking out through their eyes. Recognize that this person, like you, is temporary. Their body will age and die. Their personality will evolve. The exact person sitting across from you right now will never exist again in precisely this way. How does that awareness change how you listen to them, how present you become? This practice transforms relationships. When you interact with people knowing that every conversation could potentially be your last with them, you stop saving your kindness for later. You stop postponing forgiveness. You stop waiting for the perfect moment to express love or gratitude. The Tibetan understanding of mortality doesn't make you clingy or desperate. It makes you more generous, more present, more willing to show up authentically. Modern psychology is finally catching up to what these ancient practitioners knew. Studies show that people who regularly contemplate mortality don't become depressed, they become more focused on what truly matters. They spend less time on trivial pursuits and more time on meaningful relationships. They make decisions based on their deepest values rather than social expectations. They experience what researchers call post-traumatic growth, not from trauma but from honestly facing the human condition. The freedom that comes from accepting death is profound. When you're no longer unconsciously trying to avoid the inevitable, you stop making decisions from a place of background fear. You stop choosing safety over authenticity. You stop postponing your real life until you feel more prepared, more worthy, or more secure. You realize that the preparation you've been waiting for is actually the willingness to live fully in the face of uncertainty. This is why the Bardo Thodol isn't really a book about death, it's a manual for conscious living. Every teaching about navigating the after-death bardos applies to navigating the transitions and uncertainties of daily life. The same awareness that helps you die consciously helps you live consciously. The ancient wisdom and modern understanding are converging on a simple truth. The people who live most fully are those who have made peace with mortality. They've stopped trying to control the uncontrollable and started focusing on what they can actually influence: their choices, their attention, their responses to whatever arises. When you start living each day as preparation for the ultimate journey, every moment becomes both more precious and more peaceful. You're not frantically trying to accumulate experiences or achievements to justify your existence. You're simply showing up fully to whatever life is offering right now. knowing that this presence, this conscious participation in the mystery of being alive, is itself the point. Here's something that would have sounded like pure fantasy just 50 years ago. Ancient Tibetan monks, sitting in meditation halls, describing the journey of consciousness after death with remarkable precision, while thousands of miles away, cardiologists in sterile hospital rooms document patients returning from clinical death with nearly identical accounts. The Bardo Thodol isn't just surviving the march of scientific progress, it's walking hand in hand with it. Dr. Pim van Lommel, a Dutch cardiologist who spent decades studying cardiac arrest survivors, found himself reading Tibetan death texts with the same intensity he once reserved for medical journals. His patients consistently reported experiences that seemed lifted directly from bardic descriptions, encounters with beings of pure light, panoramic life reviews, and a profound sense of returning home. When van Lommel published his landmark study in The Lancet, he wasn't just documenting near-death experiences, he was validating a 1,000-year-old map of consciousness. The parallels are too precise to dismiss as coincidence. The Bardo Thodol describes the clear light that appears at the moment of death as the fundamental nature of mind itself. Modern near-death researchers like Dr. Kenneth Ring have documented that over 80% of people who experience clinical death report encountering brilliant, all-encompassing light that feels more real than ordinary reality. The text warns that most people, unprepared for this radiance, will flee from it in confusion. Ring's subjects describe exactly this phenomenon, feeling overwhelmed by the light's intensity and somehow choosing to turn away from it. But the convergence goes deeper than surface similarities. Neuroscientist Dr. Eben Alexander, whose own near-death experience during bacterial meningitis transformed his materialist worldview, spent months studying Tibetan bardic literature after his recovery. What struck him wasn't just the accuracy of the descriptions, but how they addressed the fundamental question that haunts consciousness research. How can awareness exist independent of brain function? His EEG readings during his coma showed virtually no cortical activity, yet he experienced what he describes as the most vivid, coherent consciousness of his life. This is where ancient wisdom crashes headlong into what philosophers call the hard problem of consciousness. How does subjective experience arise from objective matter? Why should there be an inner felt sense of being you, rather than just neural processing happening in darkness? The Bardo Thodol approaches this differently. It starts from the premise that consciousness is fundamental, and the brain is more like a radio receiver than a generator. Modern physics is beginning to catch up with this perspective. Dr. Stuart Hameroff and Sir Roger Penrose have proposed that consciousness emerges from quantum processes in cellular microtubules, suggesting that awareness operates at levels far more subtle than classical neuroscience assumed. Their theory implies that consciousness could theoretically persist in quantum fields even after brain death, an idea that would have gotten you laughed out of academic conferences just 20 years ago, but now generates serious research funding. Meanwhile, meditation research is revealing how bardic practices actually alter brain function in measurable ways. Dr. Judson Brewer's work at Yale shows that experienced meditators develop dramatically different neural patterns around the default mode network, the brain regions associated with self-referential thinking and ego maintenance. When these meditators practice bardic visualization techniques, their brains demonstrate states that researchers describe as selfless or boundaryless, exactly what the texts claim these practices achieve. The practical implications extend far beyond metaphysical speculation. Dr. Christopher Kerr at Hospice Buffalo has documented that patients who receive bardic-inspired guidance through the dying process experience significantly less anxiety and require fewer pain medications. Their families report more peaceful deaths and healthier grieving processes. Whether or not consciousness literally survives death, these ancient techniques demonstrably improve how we navigate life's ultimate transition. But here's what fascinates me most. The bardic descriptions work perfectly as maps of psychological transformation, regardless of your beliefs about literal afterlife. The wrathful deities that appear in the second Bardo, they match precisely what depth psychologists call shadow integration, confronting the rejected aspects of yourself that emerge during crisis. The peaceful deities represent what Carl Jung termed individuation, the process of becoming psychologically whole. Dr. Stanislav Grof, whose decades of consciousness research span from LSD therapy to holotropic breathwork, considers the Bardo Thodol one of the most sophisticated psychological documents ever created. His patients undergoing profound therapeutic experiences consistently encounter the same archetypal figures and landscapes described in the text. Groff argues that the bardic teachings reveal universal patterns of consciousness that emerge whenever the ordinary ego structure dissolves, whether through death, psychedelic experience, or intensive therapy. This convergence represents something larger than academic curiosity. We're witnessing a cultural shift away from purely materialistic explanations of human experience toward more integrated models that honor both scientific rigor and perennial wisdom. The National Institutes of Health now funds meditation research. Major universities offer courses in consciousness studies, hospice. Programs incorporate contemplative practices. The boundaries between ancient spirituality and modern science aren't disappearing, they're revealing themselves as artificial constructs that limited our understanding. What emerges from this integration isn't just intellectual satisfaction, but practical transformation. Understanding consciousness as the bardic traditions describe it as fundamental, luminous, and continuous changes how you approach every aspect of life. Relationships become opportunities for mutual awakening rather than ego gratification. Challenges become chances to practice the flexibility you'll need during consciousness transitions. Daily life becomes preparation for the ultimate journey, but also recognition that every moment is already that journey unfolding. The Bardo Thodol offers something our culture desperately needs, a framework for understanding death that doesn't require abandoning scientific thinking, and an approach to consciousness that doesn't reduce human experience to mere neural firing patterns. It suggests we're standing at the frontier of a new understanding, one where the deepest spiritual insights and the most rigorous scientific inquiry point toward the same revolutionary conclusion. Consciousness is far more mysterious, resilient, and fundamental than we ever dared imagine. If these profound teachings about consciousness and the nature of awareness itself resonate with your own sense that reality holds deeper mysteries than conventional wisdom suggests, I'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences in the comments below.